Wakanda forever, Uhuru, Baba Booey, and to the melanin-efficient white devils out there, a very good evening. Today, we're going to talk about the beautiful and completely normal history of the historical movement known as Afrocentrism. If you watched my previous videos and or are following me on TikTok and Instagram, you've probably seen me react to this guy over here and get a little bit of an education myself on the beauty of African history. On a more serious note, the Afrocentrist movement has been getting a lot of traction in the past few years with a lot of support from the public, both online and offline, and it actually has a history that is significantly longer than what we see right now, which is basically a lot of cringe, a lot of fringe ideologies, and a lot of weird and falsified history. Much like many contemporary movements, it started in the 19th century, which was partially the result of African American slaves that wanted to embrace their own culture, their own identity, and their own historical roots, that after generations upon generations of slavery. Again, this is nothing new. About whenever there is an enslaved people that gains their freedom, they want to get their feet on the ground. And one of those ways has always been a historical identity, a national identity, an ethnic identity, basically a way to define the in-group versus the out-group. And it has also been the result, or rather a response to centuries upon centuries of actual Eurocentrism and actual white racism against ethnic minorities. Some of the earliest advocates actually for this ideology was one Edward Wilmot Blyden, who was an academic, he was a scholar, and he was actually one of the first secretaries of state of Liberia, which, as we all know, was created as a homeland for newly liberated African American slaves so they could govern themselves and live a life of freedom far away from the slavery and the oppression that the United States offered at the time. This has also had a profound effect on the Pan-African Congress of 1896, and then later on the Harlem Renaissance of the 1920s, which sought to basically showcase that there has been a lot more African influence in world history than most historians at the time were willing to admit. This has led to African American intellectuals like W.E.B. Du Bois to say that a lot of African Americans have double consciousness and that they have a significantly different experience from other American groups that can call themselves Heritage Americans, because African Americans are in essence Heritage Americans, since a lot of them can trace their ancestry to way before the United States or even a country, much like, let's say, someone whose ancestors came to the United States on the Mayflower. They are within their rights to call themselves that. Enter the 1960s and the 1970s, when the civil rights movement is in full swing, with figures like Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr. greatly affecting the movement, and people understanding more and more that African Americans have largely contributed not just to American history, but Africans in general have contributed to world history, especially with kingdoms such as ancient Egypt, the Kingdom of Kush, Nubia, and until relatively recently, the Empire of Ethiopia, which is a very, very underrated national polity in terms of the world stage, which eventually I will be making a video on, but I'm getting off track here. The problem with the entrance of Afrocentrism in mainstream dialogue, especially through various African American groups, is the fact that a lot of those African American groups were essentially racial supremacists. Now, it's worth noting that we obviously criticize white supremacist groups like the Ku Klux Klan, like the Aryan Brotherhood, so on and so forth. But when it comes to groups like the Nation of Islam or the Black Hebrew Israelites, they get a pass. And unfortunately, they have created a lot of stories and a lot of pseudo-history to justify their group's lore, which is somehow largely accepted by, not by academia, but by a lot of people. And we finally arrived to the meat and potatoes of today's video, which is the weird, the crazy pseudo-history that surrounds the Afrocentrist movement. Because at its core, Afrocentrism is a historically revisionist movement, which, again, I acknowledge fully that it has formed as a response to a largely racist 19th century European history. But to try and create your own history from scratch will create a lot of problems. One of my favorite ones is the fact that a lot of Afrocentrists believe that ancient Egypt was this purely black nation. First of all, no, it wasn't. Parts of southern Egypt, or rather Upper Egypt as it was called because it's the upper part of the Nile, did have at times black majorities, and at some points they were ruled by African dynasties. Does this mean that all of ancient Egypt was black? No. A lot of Afrocentrists will try and convince people that the birthplace of all civilization, all culture, writing, and basically everything that is good about the world came from Africa, and more specifically, sub-Saharan African peoples, which unfortunately for them and for everyone basically, it's not true. The birthplace of civilization, as we all know, is Mesopotamia. It's not Europe, it's not Africa, and it's not Asia. The cradle of civilization, as we like to call it, has historically been the region between the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers in modern-day Iraq. However, a lot of times when people point that out to them, they will basically try and cope by saying something along the lines of, yeah, but those people were actually black. So they will still try and claim ownership over either Mesopotamia, ancient Israel, ancient Egypt, ancient Northern Africa, the Carthaginians, the ancient Greeks, and so on and so forth. So no, if you're an Afrocentrist watching this and you're offended by all of the memes that us white people post about like, oh, we was ancient Egyptians and shit, or oh, we was ancient Greeks and shit, or oh, we was the Vikings and shit. We don't do it out of racism. We do it because we find your historical claims so cartoonish that this is probably the most polite and most politically correct way we have of basically making fun of you for spewing such bullshit. But for me, some of the worst or best coping mechanisms that were devised by the Afrocentrist movement, depending on how you see them, are two actually. One of them is obviously the creation myth of Yaqub from the Nation of Islam, which is so beautifully schizophrenic. It's just, it's just perfect. And the other one is the fact that black people are the Anunnaki. According to the Epic of Gilgamesh, the Anunnaki were basically these extraterrestrial giants that came onto the Earth from outer space, basically to help civilize humankind. Now, according to some Afrocentrists, the Anunnaki are basically the answers of modern day black people that are actually native to the Earth rather than having come from outer space. And it's actually us melanin deficient white people that came out of the cave systems through portals inside the caves. Oh, sweet baby Jesus, I can just feel my brain melting as I'm saying it out loud. A lot of the times when I'm laughing while I'm filming these videos, it's because it's almost like a mental defense mechanism of sorts. Before I go, I want to say this. I completely understand that the Afrocentrist movement has largely been a response to an enslaved population that lost its roots, trying to find its rightful place in the world. Again, this is completely understandable because compared to a lot of Americans where they can trace their family's background to some place in the old world. For example, let's say you go to New York and you find an Italian American. 9 times out of 10, he will be able to tell you the exact village outside of Naples his family came from. Let's say you find a Greek American out in Astoria. He will probably be able to tell you about his family village outside of Agrinio, and so on and so forth. This is because a lot of the people that are of European descent or of Asian descent came to the United States voluntarily. A lot of African Americans didn't have that luxury, and I completely understand this. A lot of them came from what is modern day Western Africa, places like Mali, Nigeria, so on and so forth. But in these places, like I said in a previous video on YouTube Shorts and TikTok and Instagram, they didn't have this larger African identity present. They did have, though, tribal affiliations and allegiances to various kingdoms. That your ancestors came from Western Africa, like the vast majority of modern day African Americans. Said ancestors would probably have to go through forced conversion to Christianity. They would have to forget their native language. They would have to learn English, not so they would be able to understand what their masters were saying, but also so that they wouldn't be able to communicate with each other in their native language. This obviously creates a yearning within a population for their own identity and a clear-cut way for them to separate themselves from their oppressors. Instead of falling into the trap of Afrocentrism and weird pseudo-history and basically racism with extra steps, I would encourage any African that's watching this video to, first of all, be proud of your own personal achievements, because at the end of the day, you might be black, you might be white, but what matters most is what you personally do with your life. Second, I understand wanting to take pride in your ancestors' work and your ancestors' legacy. I am Greek. I completely understand this. In fact, I am a very nationalistic Greek that takes a lot of pride in his family's and his nation's heritage. But again, if you want to take pride in African polities that existed in the past, I would highly recommend looking into the history of the Empire of Mali, with emperors like Mansa Musa, who was so rich that every time he would go on tour to neighboring countries, he would destroy their economies. Or the Empire of Ethiopia, which is this incredible national polity with so much lore, starting from the Kingdom of Aksum in the ancient times, all the way to basically their deposition by the communists in the late 20th century. I think this is all for now. Yeah, Afrocentrism is a joke. Yakub did not create the white race. We did not come from the caves from the planet Nern. And I wish you all the best. If you like my work, hit the notification bell so you will get notified for whenever I post a new video. And if you really like my work, don't forget to like, share, subscribe, and comment so you can help me create more videos. And if you really, really like my work, please consider becoming a patron of mine on Patreon, where there will be more perks for you over there. See you on the next one.